Hi, this is Diana Oxley. I'm with the Northwest Regional Educational Laboratory in Portland, Oregon, and I'm talking with Stephen Dutch and Dan Scanlon. Stephen Dutch is the principal of Hillcrest High School. He's been principal for 13 years, and Dan, as assistant principal, is also lead of the social studies department, and you have other responsibilities as well, I understand. Dan, how long have you been there?
I've been here 10 years.
Okay, so you both have relatively long tenures at Hillcrest High School. What we'd like to do in this segment is learn something in greater detail about how you made the conversion from very large comprehensive high school with more than 3,000 students to 9 smaller small learning communities. How did you do that, and in what period of time, and what seemed key to making these radical changes in how you organize teachers and students?
Okay. Well, when we first began the thought of moving into small learning communities, we began to work with our partner, New Visions for Public Schools, and we began to look at the various models of transformation into small learning communities that's been utilized across the nation. And we saw at that time that there were essentially 2 models that were out there. One which was a phase-in model, and one which was a wall-to-wall conversion. And we really began to think about which would be best for us, and we moved to the wall-to-wall conversion. And we kind of, over the years, have equated the process of developing SLCs to pulling the Band-Aid off a scab on your knee. You can pull the Band-Aid off very slowly and have sustained moderate pain for 4 years. Pull the Band-Aid off real rapidly and have extreme excruciating pain for a very short period of time. And we went into having the extreme short period of pain, and it was excruciating. But we began this process in February of 2006, and during that time we really had to make major decisions, one in how we were going to structure the building, what the small learning communities were going to be, and who would be leading the small learning communities, how we would staff the small learning communities, and how we would restructure the building. So obviously you can see it was a daunting task to do within a 6-month period of time. The first piece was to be able to decide what the themes of the small learning communities were going to be. And we decided that we were going to do a career-based focus, and that we wanted to really basically cover all of the different career opportunities with the 7 SLCs that we created. We made a decision that there was going to be a need for the 2 one-year immersion programs, and that was going to provide the specific support to targeted students when they enter the school. The next thing was to be able to decide who was going to lead these small learning communities. And we made the information out to our staff and really began to canvass our staff. Who did we believe was going to be best qualified to lead these SLCs? And we had a number of candidates apply, and through a grant that we had with New Visions for Public Schools, we were able to embark on what we now call the scaffolded apprenticeship model of being able to train people to be able to have leadership within schools. And we identified a real strong group of people that were going to be leading these small learning communities. What we then began to do was talk to them, and actually in the case of 2 of our small learning communities, Humanities and BizTech, the directors themselves came up with the concept of the school and really began to frame what this SLC was going to look like within our school. We then began to look at our staff, and having identified our directors and having begun to train our directors now had the task of spreading the information throughout the building to the staff and beginning to determine which staff would be best linked to which small learning community, following the guidelines of their teacher contract, but yet getting as much input from them as possible. The next step was really looking at the building itself and being able to sit in multiple meetings and restructure space in the building, deciding which SLC would be in which part of the building, and the requirements of movement of people in offices and classrooms and book rooms and supply rooms to be able to manage the new idea that we were coming up with. The next, and probably one of the most challenging pieces, was to refocus and realign the responsibilities of the assistant principal supervision. along with the two models that have been out there nationwide, there really were only two models that we saw that were utilized for how assistant principal supervisions or department chairmen were utilized nationwide. One model was having the assistant principal lead a small learning community based on their specific strengths. So, for example, if the assistant principal had a strength in English, they may be leading the humanities SLC. The other model would be that the assistant principal ran an SLC, but also supervised the teachers within the academic areas across campus. We rejected both. We didn't really think that it was doable for the assistant principal to do both jobs well, and it really didn't focus in on our new movement towards strong adult learning, which would have a tie-in to increase student outcomes. So what essentially we believed was that the assistant principals should be freed up of a lot of the administrative responsibilities that they had in the past and be given the opportunity to concentrate on their academic area and time to be able to work collaboratively with each other to be able to build curriculum that would support adult learning across our campus. And as we've developed the SLCs, we've had different types of internships and college partnerships that were linked to specific small learning communities. So there were special programs and identities that each SLC had. But the most important thing was the continued focus on adult learning and student learning. And essentially, we've been able to accomplish that.
Okay, good.
Changing slide. So really focusing in on common planning time, something that Dan's going to talk about shortly, learning labs, developing an inquiry team, our scaffolded apprenticeship model, and the importance of staff retreats. Maybe start with the whole. Dan, why don't you talk a little about the transformation of your role from what it was to what it is?
Okay, well, like Steve said, it was really a very difficult change. Under the old model, we had really been responsible with working, like Steve said, mostly exclusively a department in a particular subject area. And a lot of what we had done focused on administrative type of responsibilities, ordering supplies, programming teachers for their programs, registering students for Regents exams at the end of the year. And, I mean, certainly a big part of our job on paper was to work with teachers and look to improve teaching and the student performance. But in reality, because of all the administrative tasks, that was a very difficult thing to do. And because so many other things came up with pressing deadlines, it was maybe pushed on the back burner a lot more than we would like. So under this new model, all of the administrative responsibilities are gone. So we can focus really exclusively on what the job was supposed to be in the first place, which is supervision and professional development of teachers. So there's been a total change in what we do in that respect.
So over the last couple of years since we've moved into this model, we've done a number of walkthroughs in the building, really, and we've been doing a lot of work focusing in on differentiated instruction and understanding by design. And yet even earlier this year, when we began to walk around the building in September and early October, we saw that the depth of work that the teachers were doing in the classrooms were merely a thin veneer of where we really wanted them to be. They couldn't crack through that veneer and go in depth in the areas that we were really pushing them upon. And we had one of our staff retreats in which we had the opportunity to bring about 20 members of our staff together that include myself, some of the assistant principals, some of the director, co-directors, the chapter leader from our teachers union within the school, and several other key players in the school to really look at what was happening. And we had a lengthy discussion about what I just mentioned about the veneer and not being able to crack through it. And at that meeting, we came up with the idea that we really needed to spend a considerable more amount of time on actual direct professional development of our teaching staff in lesson planning. And as mentioned before, we have the opportunity that we have 5 structured common planning time periods a week, as well as 5 independent common planning times a week. So we began looking at that time as time that we could really develop a concept that we call learning labs. And Dan, why don't you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, like Steve said, the learning labs really came out of observations we had made going around the building. We had, prior to the learning labs, at the time the transformation was beginning, started to spend a lot of time working with the teachers, really trying to base instruction on the work of people like Lauren Resnick. And what we saw was that there was, to some degree, a terminology that teachers were familiar with, but very little of what we wanted to see happen in the classroom was actually happening. So the learning labs, we decided, would be a good way of approaching that. We were looking for something different than what we had done in the past. So learning labs, because the teachers are available for their professional activity assignments 5 days a week, learning labs takes up 3 of those 5 days. And day one, each SLC meets with a specific assistant principal, and we really target lessons based on what the needs of the teachers are. The thing that maybe makes the learning labs different and unique from what we had been doing in the past was that all of the assistant principals collaboratively prepare lessons so that regardless of which particular SLC person teaches in, they get the same PD every week. Goes on throughout the day. On days 2 and 3, the directors work with the SLCs to reinforce and to maybe give the teachers some time to plan the work that was day 1 so that they can then go into the classroom and try to bring that somewhere into what they're doing with the kids. One of the big things that we're trying to do with the learning labs, though, is not really just go through a menu, a checklist, and say, well, we have to cover this, check, we've done that, we have to do this. We really are trying to create a situation where teachers have the opportunity to reflect on what they've done and to talk with each other and to a large extent coach each other so that we really begin to create a community where people feel very comfortable talking about what they take into account when they plan the lessons, how they go about doing that, how successful they think different strategies were. And it's not so much of a gotcha situation as much as it's really a team of people working together to try to improve instruction and, ultimately student learning.
Okay, what I'm hearing here is very interesting in that you have, I'm just going to kind of recap what you've been describing here. Very unique situation in which you have moved towards creating instructional leaders of your administrative management team. And that is pretty different, in my experience at least, where administrators usually do become, school-wide administrators become SLC administrators, but they're still managing and administering rather than functioning as instructional leaders. So you've chosen that approach, and it sounds like the New Visions partnership was a major impetus for that their focus on instructional leadership and building teacher expertise, that's a major focus they bring to that, to this work, and they've provided some leadership. Is that right? So from the very beginning, your establishment of SLCs was as much about an approach to teacher effectiveness building as it was to just merely reorganizing teachers and students.
Yeah, the New Visions model, which really spiraled into the SAMS model, or the scaffolded apprenticeship model, is really looking at leadership and building capacity in a very different way. Instead of looking at the organization from the top down with the principal at the top, you're really looking at the organization from the bottom up with a struggling student as your major focus, and doing deep, meaningful work on discovering why that particular student is struggling either in an academic classroom or in school as general. And then by developing patterns of what you've seen as to why that student was struggling in that classroom, to be able to come up not only with supports to be able to support that child in that particular setting, but to be able to make a greater leap into what's missing in the structural organization that is needed to change in order to be able to provide support to the students. That in one way was how we really decided to move to small learning communities. We had what was the SAMS 1 group of people that were doing deep work, which has become what New York City now calls the inquiry team, on a small group of students that were in one of our targeted AYP subgroups, our Hispanic male subgroup. That was a group that we were having difficulty with in the school in meeting NCLB AYP in that area. And with this group of adults doing deep work with these students, we were able to discover that one of the reasons that they felt that they were not successful in school was that they did not feel a strong connection with adults in the building, that they did not realize the supports that were available to them in the building. And had they known that these adults were there, or had they known that these supports were there, they would have availed themselves to use them at a much earlier point in their academic career. So that by creating change then within the system of moving into small learning communities and being able to create a much more personalized environment, we were going to be able to meet with success with different subgroups of students while having been able to provide support to these kids as well. So it really was a very different way of looking at school reform and looking at it really from the smallest grain rather than from the biggest chunks.
Mm-hmm. I think that is really very different. I mean, I think, you know, in general across the country, small learning communities have suffered a bit from identification with merely structural change. So we're all very clear that small learning communities mean organizing a team around some students, and so there's a smaller grouping and there's different relationships. But what is so powerful here, such a strong element of your smaller learning community model, is this, you know, this identification with building teacher capacity, and as you're calling it, providing intensified support for adult learning. And so you've mobilized your assistant principals in this work of building teacher capacity and teacher effectiveness. It's really very impressive, and I just want to, you know, underscore that I think very often, again in my experience, I see teachers and students moving into small learning communities, but with not a very, I think, sharp sense of how teaching and learning might be different. In fact, I think sometimes they go into small learning communities thinking that maybe relationships will be different, but classes and teaching will be pretty much the same. And what I hear here is that from the very get-go, teachers and administrators are working differently together to get better at teaching.
I think, Diana, once again, you've hit it right on the head, because not only in the small learning community movement, but also in the small school movement, the first key to success was that personalization piece. And if you look at the data now from small schools across the nation, you see that they're not making the same gains that they were making earlier, because they really have not changed what instruction looks like in the classroom. And that's really true in some cases with small learning communities as well. But I think what we've done well here is that we've really made the focus that we have a very powerful group of adults, them being the assistant principal supervision academic learning specialists, that have now really had the time to really begin to look significantly at how curriculum is being taught in class and how students are struggling with that curriculum and why students are struggling with certain pieces, and to then be able to restructure the way instruction has been delivered. And we have that capacity in a large school because that piece of personnel is there. That's something that has been lacking in small schools because there have not been the academic expertise people that are really needed to move this forward, as there are in a large school that's going through a self-reform.
Thank you. I think we have a pretty clear idea now of how you've approached this in such a different way. Could we just get a few more details about how you actually organize, some basic details of organization? I still am not clear on how you assign teachers to the small learning communities and students.
Okay. Initially, what we did was in New York City, teachers fill out what's called a preference sheet, and on the preference sheet, teachers list the courses that they would like to teach and the schedule that they would like to be teaching. As I mentioned earlier, we did tell the directors to begin going out and recruiting people for their small learning community, but in designing this preference sheet, teachers then picked the SLC that they wanted to be in, and we were able to match this. One of the powerful pieces about doing the wall-to-wall transformation is that you're doing it in 1 year. So all of that administrative work is being handled during that first particular year. And every teacher that was part of the Hillcrest community then had to be placed in some SLC. And we had to make sure that not one specific SLC was targeted for too many teachers who would be negative forces within the SLC. So that was all fairly distributed as well. The student piece, we really did a full high school recruitment. All of the directors were charged with getting their mission of their SLC across the school, and the building was saturated with literature, building, advertising the incoming SLCs, and students who were at that time freshmen, sophomores, and juniors were attending town meetings that were hearing about these small learning communities that were going to come in. We had a parent night in which we were doing recruiting as well. The parents had a full understanding of what the SLC would be like. And then we sent home to the parents with a stamped self-return envelope a preference sheet in which they listed in rank order which SLCs they wanted their child to go into. They signed it, their child signed it. We created an appeals process if they were not happy with the results, and then we had one person here make the placements into all of the SLCs. We have made the challenges of moving from one SLC to another as difficult as moving from one high school to another, because we have the belief that a child is making a commitment to an SLC for a year, and that it shouldn't be like a buffet, that they try one SLC for a year and then go and try another the next year, that they make a commitment to it, and the core essentials are still being taught in every one of the SLC. We have seen that as far as staff goes, and we're now in the fourth iteration of doing preference sheets, that there's almost no movement of teachers from one small learning community to another. They have really brought in together and really have formed a very cohesive unit, so that there is very, very limited amounts of teachers that want to move from one SLC to the other at the end of every year.
Okay. Dan, did you want to share some more details of the learning labs?
Yeah, Dan, maybe talk about the learning labs.
Okay. Basically, we try to base the learning labs on, as I said before, the work of Lauren Resnick, and on some PD that we had done several years ago called the Essential Elements of Instruction. And we really tried to make an assessment as to where we saw not really so much instruction breaking down, but I guess the breakdown of what we had talked about in earlier department conferences and PD and faculty conferences for a period of 2 or 3 years before that, and what was actually happening in the classroom. So we decided that we were going to start really with the basic elements of lesson planning. We have a relatively new staff of teachers in the school, and a lot of them really didn't have the focus on lesson planning in their education courses. So we spent a couple of learning labs really just on the basic elements of the lesson. We put an awful lot of focus on writing an objective. We decided that we wanted teachers to create two-part objectives, one specifying a level of critical thinking that the lesson was going to be taught at, and the other some specific proving behavior that the teacher would be looking for during the course of the lesson and at the end of the period to show that their objective was achieved. We spent a lot of time on alignment between the objective and what was happening in the classroom. One of the things that we had noticed in the past was that in their plans, if the teacher did include an objective, it might be written at a relatively high level of critical thinking, but the activities that were occurring in the classroom were really very basic. So maybe the objective would say that students would be able to evaluate or synthesize something, but everything that was done in the classroom was really just asking how or what. So there was this disconnect between what was happening in paper and what was happening in the classroom. And we've spent the last couple of learning labs, and this will probably take us through most of the semester, beginning to work on differentiated instruction so that teachers really can look very specifically at what the needs in the classroom are and come up with a number of strategies to address student needs. And we think that this, coupled with the day 2 and 3 of Learning Lab, where teachers really have a chance to plan either with people at the grade level or the subject level, all within the context of the SLC, and then have opportunities within the SLC to talk about what changes hopefully this is bringing about, or if they really aren't seeing the progress that they would like to see, it gives them an opportunity to have a common language, common area of focus, so that they can begin to decide what the next steps would be that would have to be taken.
So the professional development that you're leading and supporting then is pretty broad-based. I mean, it's helping teachers learn how to develop, well-structured classroom activities through this lesson planning process. It's geared to helping them improve their brand of instruction. They're learning how to differentiate instruction, and they're spending a lot of time too just gauging or calibrating the level of instruction. I mean, it really goes to a question of rigor then, that professional development. Teachers are learning really what kinds of activities and materials are needed to help kids think and operate at a certain identified level. Is that right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we are also trying to include in it is, when we started this, teachers were maybe somewhat skeptical about how serious we were. So we periodically do walkthroughs of classes just to see that what we're doing in the learning labs is being implemented into the classroom. So we have some kind of assessment or quality control, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, thank you very much. I think that we now have some more detail and deeper understanding of how you made the transition to small learning communities, and how you really were successful in approaching the reorganization in a way that identifies the work with a different approach to teaching and learning, as well as just a different approach to working with students in terms of, that you're going to stay with these students for at least a year, and they're going to stay in a small learning community for 4 years in at least 7 of the SLCs. I think now that the next interview that we're going to do is going to allow us to really get inside the small learning communities and learn about what's going on from the teacher's point of view. So with that, I want to thank you very much for providing these details. I think it really gives us a great window into the kind of work that you've carried out at Hillcrest with such a high level of success. Thanks so much.
Thank you.